Hey everybody, welcome to the Blendr Report, where news meets rational thinking. I'm your host, Jonathan Harvey. This is your co-host, Liam DeBoer. Liam, what are we talking about today?
Today, we're going to be chatting about Carney's empty flattery towards Europe while promising to boost defense spending to 5% of GDP to appease Trump's America, the escalating crisis between Iran, Israel, and the U.S. as ceasefire talks teeter and strikes apparently miss the mark, Canada's growing national security blind spots as Iran, Qatar, and the Muslim Brotherhood expand their influence, First Nation payouts exploding under the Liberals from $36 million to over $7 billion, a shocking school board suspension of an Ontario mom for questioning land acknowledgements, and the deeper culture war, not left versus right, but between those who shoulder their burdens and those who expect others to carry them. All right, let's get started. All right, first off, we've got Carney courts Europe with empty words and NATO with billions. Prime Minister Mark Carney has twice described Canada as the most European of non-European countries, a phrase echoed by Liberal Minister Melanie Joly, hinting at a deliberate foreign policy rebranding. Yet Carney offers little clarity on what this identity means beyond vague cultural alignment. While some interpret it as distancing from the U.S., Carney's recent NATO commitment tells another story, a dramatic pledge to raise defense spending to 5% of GDP by 2035, totaling $150 billion annually. That figure includes military funding and infrastructure development, spurred by pressure from U.S. President Donald Trump. Critics note the contradiction between Carney's pro-European rhetoric and Canada's continued use of protectionist policies. With no clear funding plan and a review set for 2029, many question whether the government can actually deliver. Ultimately, Carney appears to be walking a diplomatic tightrope, projecting European values abroad while aligning militarily with Washington. Whether this contradictory posture is strategic or incoherent remains to be seen. So, is Canada trying to play both sides between Washington and Brussels, and is that sustainable?
Yeah, I mean, clearly this is what they're doing, right? It's a balancing act between European-style diplomacy and U.S. military alignment. But I, in my opinion, this is actually nothing new for Canada. I think historically, this is sort of where we've existed. We've still been part of the British Commonwealth in a sense. However, the United States has been a superpower for the last 80 years, and they've been our strongest ally, especially when it comes to military support and trade. So again, this is sort of this dual track approach that can work if Carney turns it into a coherent Canadian doctrine. Now, right now, it looks a little more like improvisation than anything, but let's not forget he's new to the role. Starmer's relatively new to the role. Europe's always changing leadership over there. So, I mean, that's not a big surprise right now. And again, Trump just kind of got back into office and he's been wildly chaotic since he got in. So the fact that it's a little improvised right now, I don't think it's necessarily a negative. I think it's just sort of reality. But ultimately, this comes down to the relationships that I think he has with both America and the European Union. Obviously, he's deeply tied with Trump economically through Brookfield, and with the European Union, he's entrenched with a lot of their leaders, and as well, he headed the British Bank. So he's actually friends with everybody here, which if you are trying to create a balance of a relationship management, I suppose, of both sides, this is a positive. Now, I think when Europe looks at him or Canada, they consider us a convenient partner. Perhaps not a consequential one, but convenient. We don't have the diplomatic, industrial, or military clout of Germany, France, or even Poland, but we have energy resources. So if we're willing to extract them, we become valuable to them, which is obviously a positive, especially considering Europe's also on this green kick and they're struggling, shutting down coal plants. Poland just shut down their last coal plant and they're cheering about it, but energy costs are extremely high in Europe. And then when you look at Carney's 5% of GDP pledge for NATO, he's definitely, it's an unmistakable pivot to the U.S., to their strategic priorities. But I think this is a positive. And I think the way he's going about it is ultimately positive. Maybe not where he's spending all the money, but I do think that we should be meeting our target for the military. And I do like that he's willing to extract resources for this. This is something the conservatives talked about. So he's sort of adopting a conservative strategy once again, which I think will ultimately benefit Canada. So again, sure, it's a little improvised right now. Yes, he's clearly attempting to balance relationships between both sides, but historically we've done this before, and I think if it's managed well, I think it can be a positive.
When it comes to the whole European identity thing, obviously there is a shared history there. It was only the 1970s, I believe, that we officially broke away from the UK and became before then we were we were self-governing, but it was after that period that it was official. And so there is obviously a long history there, but I hate this notion that there's just no actual unique Canadian identity. Like, nobody ever wants to talk about that, really. Whether it's, Trudeau and saying we're post-national, we're going to be the first post-national state, which is a nation without an identity, which is just not a nation at all. And then now you've got Carney, who comes in and says, well, no, Canada is actually European of sorts. And I don't know. It's just like, why can't we craft a cohesive Canadian identity? I think that would solve a lot of even the cultural issues that we're seeing in play here now. But then also, as you're talking about on the NATO front, I do think Canada needs to be a little bit more serious on the military front, for sure. Even Trump has been big on how exposed we are in the Arctic. I know he's eyeing that because of that's essentially one of the places that China or Russia, if they were to ever invade North America, could possibly land and start their invasion from, because you're not landing on an American coast. So you would either have to land south somewhere like Panama Canal and transport your forces up from there, or land in our Arctic and transport down from there to get to America. You're not landing on American shores. But when it comes to this too, I see this as this very similar issue to law enforcement, where in theory, I am on board with this institution, being the military, having the proper amount of funding, but the culture within that institution needs to be correct for that funding to actually yield positive results. So just like in law enforcement, giving them more money and more power to crack down on criminals, if the entire management, top level brass of these institutions, are also corrupted by crime, it doesn't change the fact that they're not incentivized to actually do anything about it. And so I see the same problem with the military, where sure, let's make sure our military is outfitted properly, but if we've still got the head of the military saying that one of the biggest problems in the forces is heteronormativity and white supremacy and all this kind of stuff, you go, how effective are our forces really going to be?
Yeah, so there's a couple things I would say there. One, with the cultural identity of Canada, I think that they're purposely ignoring any sort of Canadian identity or trying to pretend we don't have one for two reasons. One, they've gone so far down the line of basically pretending we don't have one and convincing all these other cultures when they come to Canada they can just have their own, that it's probably too big an uphill battle to try to change that now. I also think that because Canada is so dependent on social programs, and because our population is so lopsided, so top heavy with boomers, we are going to be changing the cultural identity of Canada over the next 10 to 20 years anyway. It'll look dramatically different because the population increase is not going to stop. So whatever identity you try to establish, you're putting people in there so quickly, and you've already kind of established this formula of come here and be yourself, that even if they tried to establish one, I think there's a 0% chance they could actually get it to stick. Then with China coming in through the Arctic, you're absolutely correct. But you know what's interesting too is I also think they're so infiltrated in Canada, I think they would just come alive, like sleep themselves out of the ground. I could be wrong, but I think they'd cause some pretty significant damage that way. And one positive thing that I would say with the military is the top general, who we chatted about a couple episodes ago, she actually did come out the other day and say we should side with America and we should be buying a lot more of their equipment and more of their F-35s, which I thought was a good change of tone. Again, it still leaves a lot of the ideological crap on the table, but I was happy to see her make that shift.
Yeah, that's a shift you don't often see from people within the kind of Laurentian elite, those power circles. Obviously, they've very much for decades. This is even long before the current Liberal regime. A lot of the more elite types in Canada have very much been, okay, the Canadian identity is not being America. That's what makes us Canadian, is that we're not American. And actually, even to, the one piece that I was talking about, or that I pulled the whole European identity stuff from that Carney was pushing, they also made that point as well, that a lot of what the Canadian identity is wrapped around is just actually positioning ourselves against America. So to see people within that circle start pushing those narratives, that is actually a pretty significant change. All right, moving on to our next story. We've got a ceasefire on the brink in strikes that fell short. Iran, Israel, and the U.S. at a crossroads. The next story comes from Ground News, who we've partnered with here at Blendr. They track how news is covered across the political spectrum so you can see the full picture without the spin. Tensions in the Middle East are spiking again as a fragile ceasefire between Israel and Iran breaks down in the wake of failed U.S. airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. Trump's June 23rd announcement of a complete and total ceasefire quickly unraveled, with both sides trading blame for renewed attacks. Simultaneously, U.S. strikes on Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan nuclear sites failed to cripple Iran's capabilities, merely delaying progress by months. Ground News reveals stark media polarization. Left-leaning outlets like CNN and The Guardian call the ceasefire premature and the strikes ineffective, while right-leaning sources like Fox News and Newsmax paint Trump as a firm peacemaker and the strikes as a bold show of strength. As accusations escalate and diplomacy teeters, the region remains dangerously close to full-blown conflict. So are U.S. strikes on Iranian nuclear sites making a strategic difference, or just delaying the inevitable?
There's a lot of conflicting headlines here. So, as of yesterday, Trump came out with, and so did Tulsi Gabbard. So they've got, I think it was CIA intelligence now says that the strikes on Fordow, and the other sites were effective and did obliterate everything, I think was his exact word. Totally inoperable. He says such wild shit. It's so funny. He just sensationalizes everything. And honestly, I'm here for it. So now they're saying that they did actually totally obliterate them. But here's what I'll say about this. I really don't know. I really don't know how effective these strikes were. And you got one side of the aisle saying this has been fumbled and a disaster. He should be impeached. Now, they did the impeachment vote. They lost significantly. There was 79 votes for it. So obviously over 300 were like, what the hell are we even doing in here? So that was one side of it. The other side of it is you have kind of the people on the right saying, this is just a show of strength, and this is, we've struck fear into the hearts of, the Iranian regime and also the crap. And you know what? I think you can look at this any way you want from that perspective because it's somewhat inconsequential. What's frustrating is that I'm having trouble actually knowing what happened. So you and I spent a lot of time in the space being like, hey, we can boil down, cut through the crap and tell you the truth. That's kind of where you and I find that seeking truth seems to be my North Star. Cool. I have no idea what's happening here. I have no idea if these strikes were effective whatsoever. It seems like they were, but there's a lot of internal agency. There was an internal agency report that was leaked. So that was an agency report that said, oh, they were ineffective. I go, okay. Now, if you look at the left was actually the one showing the leak more than the right. And the right was now showing no, we totally obliterated them more than the left. So you got to be careful which side of the fence you're on with this one. But here's my take overall. You and I watched a video with Bibi Netanyahu last week that showed him saying, Iran is 2 weeks away from having nuclear capabilities. He said it in 95 or 96. Then he said it in 03 and then 06 and 2010 and 2012 and 2015 and he's been saying it constantly for the past 30 years. And the reality is, they haven't had the capability. Now, one could argue, well, that's because we've been knocking them down every time. I would argue that it's a consistent justification, perhaps, to continue military action. Now, are they wrong to do or to take military action against Iran? I don't know. I actually can't comment on that. I don't know enough about what's going on. There's definitely some negatives on how Iran is running their country. I know they've been sort of hijacked by Islam. But I really don't know if it justifies military action. I don't love war, but I don't know enough about it to say yes or no. But what I will say is, I have my doubts that they were nuclear ready in the next few weeks. So whether or not you think, the U.S. strikes totally obliterated their nuclear sites, I'm not sure if it's super important because I'm not sure that Iran was even on the doorstep of nuclear capabilities. So unfortunately, I'm leaving you with more questions, but I'm giving you at least some context to try to wrestle with it on your own.
Well, and that's why, to be honest, I actually don't even like talking about these wars and this kind of stuff so much, is because it is just lies coming at you from every angle, and they're militarized lies as well, in the sense where they're legitimate propaganda campaigns. Like every single one of these nations, like, so for instance, in this case, you're going to have American propaganda being shoved down your throat. You're going to have Iranian propaganda, Israeli propaganda, Russia, China. They're going to try to spin their own narrative, or at least support one of those people's narratives. Qatar is going to start throwing out their own narratives, all this. And so you're just getting inundated with lies from every single direction. And that's why I find it so hard to ever come up with a actual opinion that I would stand on hard, whether it be Iran and Israel, whether it be Russia and Ukraine. Like, I just come from the base point of I can't even possibly start to comprehend what is actually going on in these scenarios. And then I think Orwell nailed it best. Sometimes I've heard that this is paraphrased from him, but either way, whether he said it directly or not, this sentiment rings true, where he said, "In times of war, the first casualty is truth, and the most stirring battle reports are always those which no one can verify. The heroism is endless, and the fighting is always in the next street or the next village over. I saw great battles reported where there had been no fighting, in complete silence where hundreds of men had been killed. I saw troops who had fought bravely denounced as cowards and traitors, and others who had never seen a shot fired hailed as the heroes of imaginary victories." And I mean, even like you go look back at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war. I can't remember what the nickname was, but remember there was those videos floating around of one of the fighter pilots, or that was supposed to be like this big hero, and then you learn out that all of that footage is actually just fake, and this is an entire propaganda campaign story. That stuff happens all the time in these scenarios. Actually, I'm just about to finish a really interesting book in regards to that in Canada, where in a 1990s peacekeeping mission in the Yugoslavian wars in the Baltic regions in the early 1990s, when Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, all of this, when tensions were rising there, how there was a military unit in Canada that got in between the Serbs and the Croatians, and they actually stumbled across a genocide that the Croatians had, or an ethnic cleansing event that they had perpetrated. And just like, I'm not even going to detail it. It's some pretty gruesome stuff. But these Canadian soldiers then came back, and it was at the same time there was a peacekeeping scandal that happened with Canada in Somalia, and they tortured a Somalian, like Canadian military forces did. And so the Canadian military and political class just wanted to get away from anything that could be possibly a scandal. So they covered up all this stuff that they came across in Croatia. So like, even in that, you're seeing, okay, they gaslit the entire nation, and even the soldiers that were there and saw it and actually like lived through this, they completely fabricated alternative narratives to everything that was happening there. So this is just a long-winded way of, getting back to why this is why I actually think certain platforms like Ground News are so important in this, is because they do give you that, like, okay, at least even if I know everything is lies, I can kind of start to understand where they're trying to incentivize me to go with their lies. But yeah, it's a wild world out there, especially when it comes to these wars.
I see things very similarly, and what I think is interesting about taking in the information from both sides on war specifically is every political side, right, left, they usually have a political interest with every story they're telling. And when you look at war, it's not always easy to tell what their interests are. So when you are able to compare both sides, you start getting a more clear picture of what's actually going on. And what's interesting is you start understanding the incentives and the interests of your political party if you are willing to sort of see through that, which I think a lot of our listeners are. So yeah, no, very much same page. And he was The Ghost of Kiev was the imaginary fighter pilot that you were talking about.
Right.
If you're tired of biased headlines, algorithms feeding you what you want to hear, or just trying to figure out what's actually true, Ground News is the tool you need. We've partnered with them because we actually use it and it helps. Their Vantage Plan is what we use. It gives you all the headlines, the bias ratings, blind spot alerts for when sides are ignoring a story, and even shows you who owned the outlet that you were reading. It's basically a media literacy tool that lets you see under the hood. And right now you can get 40% off their Vantage Plan using our link, groundnews.com/blender. That's their top tier plan for only around $6 a month. And trust me, it's worth every penny. And they're a Canadian company, which is always great. Again, that's groundnews.com/BLENDR to get 40% off.
All right, moving on to our next story. We've got Iran, Qatar, and the Muslim Brotherhood, Canada's national security blind spot. Two explosive reports have exposed a dangerous vulnerability in Canada's national security, foreign influence operations, particularly from Iran and Islamist networks like the Muslim Brotherhood. They are infiltrating Canadian institutions with little resistance. The Canada Border Services Agency has identified senior Iranian regime officials living in Canada, but deportation has been slow, with only one removal completed. Meanwhile, over 100 investigations are underway into immigration files with regime ties. A separate report by ISGAP warns that the Muslim Brotherhood has quietly embedded itself into Canadian civil society through registered charities and foreign-funded academic programs, many linked to Hamas ideologies. Qatar, a known Brotherhood supporter, has funneled millions into Canadian institutions, including McGill University. Critics argue that Canada's legal and political framework is ill-equipped to confront this threat, fearful of backlash, overly tolerant, and painfully slow to act. So are Canadian institutions too politically fearful to act on national security threats?
Ultimately, yes. Canadian institutions are paralyzed by political correctness, especially when threats involve religious or ethnic sensitivities. There seems to be sort of a systemic unwillingness to confront ideologically motivated threats, like Islamist extremism or really any foreign authoritarian influence, especially our elections. From a structural perspective, Canada's legal and bureaucratic processes are just too slow and risk-averse. So what I mean is we don't really deal with modern asymmetric threats because by the time deportation or investigation is complete, the damage is pretty much already done. And ultimately, this isn't just a policy failure, it's a values failure for Canadians. And I don't really see a way back. I don't see how we correct course here.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, even too, when you see, okay, so for instance, the Muslim Brotherhood is this organization that promotes the idea that Islam should spread across the world. Even nations in the Middle East have declared it as a terrorist organizations, such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Canada, however, is completely cool with it still. Even if you look at the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, that took us, like the IRGC, Iranian military, that took us a very long time to recognize as a terrorist organization. I think that only happened a year or two ago, but
yeah,
that was like
super recent.
That was like years behind other nations. But then one of the clearest examples of this is even June 6th, just 20 days ago, Prime Minister Mark Carney chose to deliver a speech at the Muslim Association of Canada, a self-declared Muslim Brotherhood legacy group. So this group believes that Islam should dominate the world, and then we've got our Prime Minister at their community events talking about how glad he is to have their support and how important the work is that they're doing all together and blah, 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 all these political, cliches. But I think for sure, whether it be this, whether, we did that whole documentary into China, how China conquered North America without firing a single shot. This is one of those scenarios where it's very similar. It's just coming from a different direction, being more Middle Eastern extremism rather than, say, the Chinese Communist Party. But yeah, our political class, I think, is... I don't think anybody's a monolith in the sense where different people have different motivations, but I think some people are in our political class where they genuinely are on board with these aims. Like they actually sympathize with, say, the ideals of the Muslim Brotherhood. Or you've got people that are just completely corrupt and are on the take, probably getting paid from somewhere with one of these organizations. Or you've got people that just seemingly want the votes as well. Like, I mean, hell, even too, you see the Khalistani insurgents, this offshoot of Sikh extremism from India. Like, our politicians, even Pierre Poilievre has spoken at their events. Doug Ford was at one of their community events wearing their garb and like bowing in front of their religious monuments and all this kind of stuff. And then you go look at all of the major drug busts recently where they're catching these truckers with tens of millions of dollars in cocaine and other narcotics. And it's very clear if you go look at the arrest names warrants that they're coming from a specific group, being mainly the Khalistanis. And then so you've got our politicians pandering to these people as well. It's wild. And so, yeah, I just don't think there's the political will here because, to your point, we've got this idea of, say, multiculturalism, and we have to be so accommodating for other cultures that even pointing to the fact that, hey, maybe certain nefarious actors are coming from certain regions of the world. Well, you can't say that. That's taboo.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. I think the point that I would take away from that, or what I would add to it, is this shows you, to an earlier point, that Canada's identity is completely lost. But I also think that we are pandering to groups that are trying to infiltrate the country to make it their own. And they're groups that we don't necessarily want to align with. And I don't mean that in like that all the individuals are bad. What I mean is we culturally clash with their ideology. So Canada's going down the wrong path, and appeasing these people is only going to cause us more destruction in the future.
Right. Yeah. I don't see how you can have both. At some point you have to pick, like, let's say, okay, one of the, and I'm not even trying to say which ones they should pick or whatever. I'm just pointing out the
they should pick none of them. They should pick none of them. No, quite honestly, they shouldn't. There's no way. But you shouldn't be aligning deeply with anybody else's interests.
What I was going to say is that they come into conflict with their own values in the sense where, okay, we're all for, say, women's liberation here and making sure that women have autonomy over their lives and their bodies and all this kind of stuff. But then we're also going to align
Tell you can marry 9-year-olds over there, you fucking psychos. Sorry.
And also that want to put into power or place Sharia law, which would take all of those things away. It's like you can't have both. You have to pick one.
Yeah.
All right, moving on to our next story. We've got from 36 million to 7 billion. Ottawa's First Nations payouts explode under Liberal rule. Since 2015, the federal government has spent nearly $18 billion settling specific claims with First Nations, claims related to historical grievances like broken treaty promises and mismanaged lands. A new report from the Fraser Institute reveals that annual payouts have skyrocketed from just $36 million in 2015 to over $7 billion in 2024-2025, largely due to Liberal reforms that replaced litigation with negotiation. The fastest growing category is cows and plows claims, agricultural disputes stemming from 19th century treaties. Critics argue the current process lacks accountability as the federal government plays both judge and defendant. Without deadlines or clear limits, the program risks become a bottomless funding mechanism with little public oversight. The study warns that if left unchecked, what began as a path to reconciliation may evolve into a politically motivated entitlement program, one immune to scrutiny and disconnected from justice. It calls for hard deadlines and a sunset clause to restore balance and fiscal responsibility. So are we witnessing meaningful reconciliation, or is this just performative politics paving the way for corruption?
It is just corruption. This is 100% just corruption. When it's increased by that much money in a single year, this is wildly out of control. They're essentially acting as both the referee and the player here too, right? They're deciding, claims it is financially responsible for, and then paying these things out. So there's no impartial justice here. So now we're where we usually land with Liberal policies, where virtue signaling replaces accountability, and taxpayers foot the bill for settlements that are really no longer grounded in reality. Now, I'm not saying that there should be nothing provided for the Indigenous, like financially. I have no real problem with this, but this is just blatant corruption. There's blatant corruption, and the thing is, because it's behind, because when you kind of look at like when you kind of look at the stack of the oppression Olympics and where people rank in that category, and you look at the Indigenous, well, because this is where the money is going, we can't say anything about it. So what's happening effectively, like, it's not like the Liberal government's doing this and going, no, we really owe these people this money. This is definitely fair. What are they covering up? What are they buying for this? What are they getting access to? Who is, because there's no free lunch. So if you're pouring out $7 billion a year for this, what's actually happening? Because again, if you're buying silence or you're paying off something for, somebody for something. So I don't know what that is. And it's unfortunate because at least with the Green Slush Fund, we could see where the money was going to which companies. Oh, actually, they covered that up too. Yeah. So again, right. So again, this is where liberal policies usually land, and Canadians should be pissed off.
Well, I think too, there's an extra level of corruption here when it comes to especially how these Indigenous communities are ran, because they're self-governing, right? So as soon as the money lands in those pockets, there's no oversight on our end. So I can see that 100% happening where, okay, we're going to give you this amount of money for this, the fact that we're given the money for treaties that are being said to have been broken in the 1800s.
Right,
like,
come on,
get out of here.
At least make up a new excuse.
Yeah,
at least do a better job of lying to me. Jesus.
And so I could see multiple things here, and I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And now, like I said, this is a black hole. So once that money gets onto these reserves, we have no oversight. So this is just speculation on my end. But I wouldn't be surprised if first certain politicians are getting kickbacks for that. I know, crazy idea, right? And then also the other one would just be like pay to play for votes, just like I was saying in that last topic. When it comes to diaspora communities, it's like, hey, this is how politics works in a sense too. Even if it's certain representatives for certain communities, they come to the table in Ottawa or whatever, and they say, hey, if you want me to go along with your agenda or your plan, or if you want my constituents to back your ideas, here's the cost, whether it be an infrastructure deal, whether it be aid funding, whether it be whatever. And so there's just a pay to play scenario happening as well. And I could see that for sure coming into play here as well.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with both of those sentiments. I think that there's definitely kickbacks and they're definitely buying votes. I think that's 100% where at least some of this money is going. So again, I don't know. The system's such a mess. What can you do? The empire needs to fall.
There is a little bit of an Overton window shift here, at least, though, because you even saw recently with Doug Ford coming out over the last, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks, in saying that the Indigenous communities in Canada need to start building themselves up, and they can't just continue coming hat in hand to the government for subsidies. And I think he's entirely correct. Like, you can never become self-sustaining through dependency. So those ideas just conflict in and of themselves. But I don't think you would have heard any Canadian politician, whether it be provincial, federal, or of the like, say 5-10 years ago in the height of, say, woke culture, because it's definitely on the decline. So I don't think you would have heard any politician say that as soon as 5 years ago, because it would have been career ending in the political realm. But hopefully that's a skill that pushes it this way, because even too, when it comes to, say, the Indigenous prosperity, even that whole situation about them being self-governing ends up, at least their current governance style, ends up allowing this pattern to just continue and continue, because right now, the tribes, at least this is how it works in the vast majority of them, is that everything is like communally owned. These reserves essentially operate as socialist and communist little hubs. Like the tribe owns the houses and they rent it out to the individuals there. There's no property ownership. And so, like, how can you ever expect these communities to become wealthy if they can't even own wealth? It doesn't make sense. And then this is where you get this massive level of disparity between, say, the people that are in the administration positions of these tribes and these reserves, and then the people that are actually living on them that still don't have clean water. Because how, like, whether it be this stuff and the $7 billion going down there in settlements for historical stuff that happened in the 1800s, or whether it be funding that is supposed to go towards things like infrastructure and clean water, again, if all that money is just being put in the hands of a potentially corrupt ring of administrators, then it never actually gets to the people that it was intended for in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what's going on, right? We're sending tens of billions of dollars to them for different reasons every year, and that number continues to increase. So it is good that you see someone like Doug Ford say something, even if it just quells the volume of capital going their way. But we'll see what the pushback is like politically, because they'll fight back on what he said, and then we'll just see how the politicians rally around them, and that'll probably be a good indicator of exactly what's going on and why. Because no politician losing that much money for the country, or taxpayer dollars, that, like you said, it's not really solving their problem. They should be on board to be like, yeah, actually, you know what, we do need to create some independence for their culture and their people, and continuing to just funnel the money. Well, this isn't working. So I would keep an eye on what other politicians, especially at the federal level, have to say about what he said, if it ever even comes up again. But ultimately, no, I agree with you. I just think we're getting to this point where everything in this country is becoming bureaucratic and bloated in terms of cost expenses on taxpayers. And this is actually one of the most significant ones. So if we're going to start tackling issues, this might not be a bad place to start.
Yeah, actually, maybe the last thing I'll tag on to this topic here is a story by a guy named Kirk Reese, who is an ex-Canadian Ranger. And he highlighted a scheme that he says is happening on a lot of these reserves and stuff, especially the more remote ones, because now he's an ex-Ranger. This is just kind of his word against everybody's, although he does have some documents and stuff hinting and pointing to what he's talking about. So take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. But I mean, the strategy checks out in my mind. I could see this happening easily. Even if it wasn't on an Aboriginal, just the incentives are there. The avenue is open for this amount of corruption, which is that, okay, so the Rangers, which is a part of the Canadian federal government, they are in charge of looking for missing persons on the Indigenous reserves in some of these more remote areas, right? Well, what Kirk was saying is that, and he worked with one of these reserves, is that the way these Rangers get paid is they get white slips. So depending on the equipment they use in order to go and find one of these missing persons depends on how much they get paid. So it's not just like a random salary. It's, oh, this person went missing and you had to use an ATV to get there. Your equipment costs, therefore, we'll give you, these are just arbitrary numbers. I can't remember the ones he told me, but it's like, let's say, okay, $800, right? Well, what he was saying ends up happening on these reserves a lot of the times is that you'll get fake missing persons claims, and I've talked about how high our numbers are, which is that in BC it's over 250 missing persons per 100,000 compared to California, which is 8 missing persons. So that's a massive difference. But then, so he was saying how what happens is these Aboriginal communities will say somebody went missing, and then you get a whole team of Rangers, like 20 guys, that say, oh, we had to use this equipment to go find this person. They say, oh, yeah, this person was found. But because this is happening in such gray zones, essentially, on these reserves where there's no oversight, nobody is actually checking these things. And so you just get this money being handed to the federal government, to these Rangers and to these Aboriginal communities in order for these search parties that never really should have happened. And Kirk Reese was saying that, you know, the amount of money that is coming in from these schemes is millions upon millions of dollars, where maybe only one person actually went. But yeah, they said it was 20. And so it inflates the costs like crazy. And so, yeah, I think the amount of corruption and payoffs and the black hole of finances on Canadian reserves is probably incomprehensible.
And that's just one example, and it's only millions, and we're talking about tens of billions. It's a deep, dark hole. Yeah, it's wild.
Before we move on to the next topic, this episode is brought to you by the Tallow Truth. Your skin needs real nourishment, not lab experiments. That's why I use F-Bomb from the Tallow Truth, made from grass-fed, grass-finished tallow. It's also hormone-free, antibiotic-free, steroid-free, GMO-free, and even vaccine-free, because I know that's important to a lot of you. There's nothing artificial, nothing toxic. And recently, Ben and the gang at Tallow Truth dropped some new products. Their Freedom Face Whip is hands down the nicest thing I've ever put on my face. And they've also launched a new soap line made with grass-fed tallow and organic essential oils. What makes the Tallow Truth even better is that they're a Freedom First brand that supports Blendr News and everything we stand for. They even offer a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you've got nothing to lose. Go to the tallowtruth.com/blender and use code BLENDER for 15% off. This includes 15% off on already discounted bundles as well, so you can save as much as 40%. That's the tallowtruth.com, code BLENDR at checkout for 15% off.
All right, moving on to our next story. We've got suspended for dissent. An Ontario mom punished for questioning land acknowledgements. Catherine Cronis, an elected school council representative in Ontario, was suspended for respectfully objecting to a land acknowledgement during a board meeting. Citing concerns over compelled speech and political ritual in a government institution, she requested her dissent be entered into the minutes. Weeks later, she was banned from future meetings without any stated policy violation, explanation of harm, or opportunity to defend herself. Legal experts argue this is a clear violation of her charter rights. The incident highlights a troubling trend in Canadian institutions. Dissent is no longer tolerated, and symbolic gestures are being enforced as mandatory ideological doctrine. So just before we get into the question and discussion here on this topic, I thought it might be a good idea to just pull up the video because it's only about a minute long.
Hi, I'm Catherine Cronis, and I just wanted to say, as a parent member of the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board, I would like to emphasize that Principal does not speak on my behalf with regards to the land acknowledgement. In my view, the board's imposition of a land acknowledgement during our school council meetings undermines the democratic process and constitutes a form of compelled speech, which I believe contravenes the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. There is no school board policy mandating its inclusion. In my opinion, the sentiments implied by the land acknowledgement are political in nature, highly controversial, and therefore divisive and inappropriate within a government institution, and I respectfully request that my objection be noted in the minutes of this meeting.
So that's the extent of it. That's what she got suspended for, was just saying, hey, this practice that goes on in these meetings, I don't agree with it, and I'd just like that to be recognized.
I just like how they bleed. I like how they bleed to the principal's name because I just heard Principal Face. Sorry.
But yeah, no, it's wild that is enough to get you kicked out of these meetings within school boards. Now, I was just talking about an Overton window shift with Doug Ford in the public space, but within these institutions, within the halls of education, and especially when it comes to these more administrative positions, which are usually staffed by the DEI types, like the fact that you can't even just say, hey, I think this is overly political for education is wild.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very lopsided left-wing extremist sort of category of people, like these institutions. And I understand that's stereotypical, sure. But if you had to point at the institutions that were the most extreme and left-wing, where would you point? The first place I would point is the education system. That's the first place I would point. And so people are like, oh, maybe that's a little offside. Okay, well, then tell me where you'd point instead. Because that's exactly where I'd be looking. So, I mean, look, to your question, can dissent still exist in Canadian public life without punishment? It's hard to say, right? Like this case shows that dissent is being rebranded as misconduct, especially when it challenges progressive or symbolic orthodoxy like land acknowledgements. Canadian institutions are increasingly enforcing ideological compliance, using vague authority and procedural loopholes to silence even, like you said, respectful disagreement. I mean, take Jordan Peterson, for example. He was a little less respectful, but he's well within his rights to think that Trudeau is an absolute asshat. So, I mean, I think that they overstepped there too, and you're seeing it more frequently. I think what's happening is public life is becoming a loyalty test, not a forum for debate. And if this trend continues, democratic participation will be replaced by performative obedience. And I think at that point, everyone should leave Canada.
I think it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out because as I was mentioning, I do think the public sentiment has shifted on these kinds of things. And I always said too, was like, man, the minute people's wallets get real tight, they're going to stop caring about whether it be climate change, whether it be the historical racism, white supremacy that happened 300 years ago, or the land acknowledgement stuff. Like, when people aren't living comfortably and they're being squeezed, these are luxury beliefs. These are luxuries to care about.
They are. But one thing I would say to challenge that just a little bit is Canadians are already feeling the squeeze. When the average family of four is going $8,000 further into debt just to afford the average cost of living for four in Canada, the squeeze is there. Yet they still voted Liberal because the media and propaganda machine convinced them Trump was the real problem, and therefore Poilievre was not a guy you could vote for. So I agree with you. My only thing that I would say is I think that line is further down the road than you and I would like to believe. That's all.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just mean, even too, like, I've heard even more people, not that I've even brought up, but I've heard multiple times over the last couple months, actually, just people randomly bring up how they think our obsession with giving handouts and the amount of money going to the Indigenous communities for these things like settling suits or treaty disagreements from 1800s, like, more and more people are feeling comfortable saying this is ridiculous. And so we're getting to this weird point where now, because 5-10 years ago, nobody had the balls to say that out loud because of the social ramifications for doing so. Oh, well, you're a white supremacist and you don't care about anybody. That's what would get thrown your way. But what I'm pointing to is like how 5 to 10 years ago, the cultural sentiment was in line with the establishment view. It was cohesive across both of those domains. But now you're getting the social view, the more general Overton window is moving away from the establishment point, which is this land acknowledgement stuff and this, or like, quote unquote, woke orthodoxy. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out now, with there being a bit of a difference, to go back to quoting the GOAT Orwell, where he said, all tyrannies rule through fraud and force, but once the fraud is exposed, they have to rely exclusively on force. And that's where you're seeing this kind of stuff, right? It's like, oh, the fraud was like, oh, we're all on board with this. This is what everyone thinks. And so you kind of go along with it. But once you go, I'm not actually on board with this anymore, we'll see how forceful these institutions become.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think what'll be interesting to watch is, because this is an ever-changing landscape, to watch how public discourse outside of the institutions, while it may be rising, how much it actually affects what's happening in the institutions, because the institutions fight. Because they have the authority. It's the old, you give them an inch, they take a mile, you give them a thread, they knit a sweater. They want to maintain that authority. So it will be interesting to watch what the disproportionate volume of pushback has to be outside the institutions before the institutions themselves actually make the change. So anyway, I guess we'll see over time.
All right, last story for the day. We've got the real culture war. Those who bear burdens versus those who demand relief. The real divide in society isn't left versus right. It's between those who can carry life's burdens and those who believe others should carry them for them. Everyone is born with a metaphorical boulder, the weight of suffering, duty, and consequence. Some lift it, grow stronger, and help others along the way. Others drop theirs and demand the strong carry more, believing their pain justifies exemption. At first, the weight redistribution is manageable, but as more people abandon responsibility, the few left bearing the load begin to collapse. Strength is punished, not rewarded. Resentment grows. Eventually, the dependent turn on the competent for not doing enough, triggering a call for total control to equalize the burden. This is how civilizations fall, not all at once, but when no one remembers how to carry their share. Compassion doesn't mean removing the boulder, it means walking beside someone as they learn to lift it. A society built on strength, duty, and self-mastery can endure. One built on grievance, dependency, and coercion cannot. Ignore this reality and collapse will come. Not with fire, but with the silent crush of 1,000 boulders dropped by a generation too fragile to carry them and too entitled to try. So is it possible to restore a cultural ethic of responsibility in a generation raised to expect relief?
Yeah, I mean, restoring responsibility starts with rejecting the lie that struggle is oppression. And generations were once taught that hardship builds character. Today it's framed as injustice to be outsourced, which is ridiculous. culture institutions are, school, media, even parenting. They've normalized fragility, and they're rewarding grievance over grit and turning victimhood into currency. We see this all the time. But responsibility is contagious. Like you said in your previous conversation, when enough people jump on board, things will start to shift. So when enough individuals quietly choose strength, accountability, and self-mastery or self-responsibility, it will create a cultural shift from the ground up. The challenge isn't necessarily the ability, though. It's our will.
Yeah. And this is a point that you've made before where, social programs and stuff work when, say, the top 80% is subsidizing 20% temporarily, when it's just people that, say, lost their footing, got injured at the workplace, whatever, can't work right now, or need to turn it around when it comes to, say, even if it's something a little bit more social, like, say, addiction. But that, when it comes to those things, there still has to be an underlying expectation that you're going to pick yourself back up again. Like, it can't just be this endless sustaining of handouts. And the analogy that, I used throughout this essay is, carrying the boulders up the hill. Well, yeah, if you've got 8 people carrying their boulders just fine and they take on a little bit of weight from those other 2 that are struggling and slipping and lending a hand to stabilize them, that's fine. I can get behind that in concept. But it's when you've got 5, 6 people that are now just, sitting down, complaining, they don't actually even want to regain their footing, and trying to toss that effort and load and requirement onto the other 5. It's like, at a certain point, it becomes unbearable. And actually, the more weight that you put on those people, like in an analogy you've used before when it comes to these social programs, well, now if 50% are carrying not only their weight, but the bottom 50%, you're going to now increase the amount of people that can't carry their load because they have to carry someone else's as well. And this is something, like, I know it can get a little bit abstract in society when we're talking about this kind of more on a macro scale. But even think about this in terms of, like, a household or a workplace. Like, okay, if you're in a house, it takes a lot of things to keep the house going. You've got to keep up with the yard work, cooking, cleaning, all of this, bills, paying the bills. One person can't do all of that. And so if you just have this culture that is allowing more and more people to say, essentially, hey, just sit on the couch and don't actually do what's expected of you, these responsibilities, then eventually you're going to get to a point where that house crumbles.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I think that's a good way of looking at it, more from a societal level, and you kind of look at it. It's funny, you took the data approach, which is usually something I do. Because when you do look at it like that, you look at it from a society perspective. If people don't start improving and taking on more self-responsibility for their lives, you are going to see a massive shift in how your country operates. You're going to sort of put it the way you said, and this may be a little over the top, but you see it shift from a productive capitalistic society to something more closer to, say, communism, or like this deep sort of socialism, which, like you said, always kind of comes first. And it's interesting to look at it like that, because these kinds of conversations, people usually look at individually. Well, I need to make this change for myself, or this is what needs to happen so this person can have a better life. That's kind of how the framing of our topic started. But when you look at how that cascades into a macro level, it will ruin an entire society. So you don't just have a responsibility for yourself. You have a responsibility for your entire society and all the other people around you to make these improvements and to take responsibility for your life and go back to some of the tools that previous generations used to have more successful, fruitful, less depressing lives.
I think, too, a lot of people sell themselves short on how big of an influence they can have on those around them and how things can shift culturally. Just, not any single one person, but here's a good example is when it comes to, say, health and fitness. Like, I have a buddy, I was out of shape, I was drinking a lot. This was probably, this was 2017, 2016, maybe even a long time ago. But I was partying, drinking a lot, not eating well. And buddy walks by me and just goes, "Yo, you're getting fat." And we weren't even that close. So for him to say that to me at work out of nowhere was kind of like, wow, that is a wake up call. And I couldn't even get mad because I was like, he's right. But then I started working out like crazy, started running marathons. And then what I saw happen after that was I had all of these friends that when I first started running those marathons and stuff were like, you're crazy. I would never do that. I have zero interest in that. Well, now like 4 out of my 5 closest friends have run a marathon and I didn't push them. It was just simply because it was just ended up like see monkey do essentially, right? And so you can have that within your community or household or all this kind of stuff that, all right, hey, you start pushing yourself, whether it's a business wise or whether it be health or any of these sorts of domains. Other people definitely start picking up on that into this other point when people start seeing other people take the load off and say, I don't want to carry my responsibility anymore. That mindset is also contagious and infects the other people around you. So like sometimes it does just take somebody to kind of go like, I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that, yeah, like I don't think people should sell themselves short on how much influence they can have on others around them. And it often takes a lot less than you would think.
Yeah, no, I agree. So I think the moral of the story is you just need someone to call you fat. And
yes.
But more importantly, to sort of what we were saying earlier and how society is kind of breeding this mediocrity, when your doctor is not allowed to have a conversation with you about you being overweight because you're too sensitive, what do you think happens to society? So yes, you do need individuals and friends in your life to tell you when you need to pull up your socks and make improvements, but also society at large. We need to get rid of all this nonsense, virtue signaling bullshit and just be honest with people again, because ultimately it's for their own good.
Well, and I think too, it's important that it actually comes from friends and people close to you, because then you know that it's coming from a place of this person cares about me. Whereas if it's just coming from, say, quote unquote, society at large or all these other social pressures, then there's not really that connection there that you would get from somebody. So like you might not have the same relationship with your doctor. But if, hey, your significant other comes to you and says, hey, I'm kind of worried about the trajectory that you're on, whether it be financially, whether it be health or whatever it is, then it comes with a little bit more care and compassion, I guess. Then I think it helps land a little bit better.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think here's what I would say though. There's an appeal to authority, right? So if your doctor is saying, hey, this is like, my mom is like, the doctor knows Jonathan. I'm like, well, your doctor's 85. I'm not sure if they know more than I do, but all right, do your thing. So there is this sort of appeal though, where that can be an effective strategy to say, hey, the institutions you trust are also saying, maybe we got the food pyramid wrong. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, maybe we cocked this up a little. So I agree. I think both are effective strategies. I think different people will operate and will take action depending, and different people will take action from different sources. But in both cases, I think they're important. So it would be good to see society shift in that direction, because ultimately, it's the same reason why I do all this. I want everybody's life to get better. I want people to live longer and I want people to live a better life. That's why, honestly, I do a lot of things that I do because it comes from a decent place. And I think a lot of your friends, if they are real friends, would do the same for you. So find friends that'll call you fat.
All right. Anything else you wanted to add before we get out of here?
No, that's everything.
Don't forget to head over to our Substack where you can sign up for our newsletter, which goes out 5 days a week. It also has all the sources that we talk about throughout the podcast. That's blendrnews.substack.com, blendrnews.substack.com. You can also sign up for a paid subscription there if you want to help support the show, as it helps the engine keep on going. However, again, it is free if you'd like. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next week.
Bye, everybody.